It was supposed to be a quiet trip. No cameras, no headlines, no fights. But by the time the sun went down over Bangkok in 1972, word had already spread that Bruce Lee was in the city, and that alone was enough to set events in motion that would end with a Muay Thai champion lying unconscious on a concrete floor. A story whispered for decades and officially denied by everyone who mattered. What most people never understood was that Bruce Lee didn't come to Thailand looking to prove anything. He came to learn, to feel the rhythm of a country where fighting wasn't entertainment but heritage, where boys grew up kicking banana trees until their shins went numb and pain stopped registering as pain at all. And for the first few days he did exactly that. He watched quietly from the back of gyms, asked polite questions, took mental notes, nodded with genuine respect. But respect is a strange thing in the fight world, because to some men it sounds exactly like arrogance, and no one embodied that. Tension more than Somchai preserved, the reigning Muay Thai champion of Bangkok, a man with over 200 professional fights, whose elbows were rumored to have ended careers, and whose name alone was enough to make opponents reconsider stepping into the ring. Somchai had heard about Bruce Lee long before he arrived, had seen the posters, the film reels, the interviews where Bruce spoke about speed, efficiency, and truth in combat. And to Somchai those words felt like an accusation, like a foreigner telling Thailand it had been fighting the wrong way for centuries. And when one of Somchai's trainers mentioned, almost casually, that Bruce Lee was visiting Lumpini Stadium that afternoon, Somchai didn't laugh, didn't scoff, didn't smile. He just wrapped his hands tighter and asked a single question. Does he think he can fight? That question traveled fast, through trainers and gamblers and promoters, until it reached a well-dressed middleman who knew how these things were handled quietly, without press, without contracts, without permission. And that man found Bruce Lee that evening at a small open-air gym, where ceiling fans did little to push the heat around, and the smell of sweat hung thick in the air. Bruce listened as the message was delivered. Not aggressive, but not polite either. An invitation that wasn't really an invitation at all, because everyone understood what declining would mean. And when the man finished talking, Bruce didn't answer right away. He watched two teenage fighters sparring in the corner, noticed the way one overcommit on every kick, how the other waited patiently for openings, and only then did he speak, his voice calm, almost conversational, saying he hadn't come to challenge champions or disrespect traditions. That Muay Thai was a beautiful, brutal art forged in reality, not theory. But the man delivering the message shook his head slowly and said that beauty wasn't the issue, pride was. And in Bangkok, pride didn't ask twice. Bruce could have walked away, could have flown back to Hong Kong the next morning, and no one would have blamed him. But something about the situation bothered him, not fear. Bruce didn't experience fear the way other men did, but the idea that arts were being measured by flags instead of effectiveness, by history instead of truth. And when the messenger asked him again, quietly, if he accepted, Bruce nodded once and said there would be no audience, no cameras, no betting, no promotion, just fighters. Because if this was going to happen, it would happen honestly. The location was set for just after midnight, not in the stadium itself but behind it, in a training space used by fighters long past official hours, a place where disputes had been settled before without records or witnesses willing to talk. And as the night approached, Somchai prepared the way he always did, methodical, focused, wrapping his hands while his trainers reminded him not to underestimate speed, though none of them truly believed speed could overcome the conditioning of Muay Thai, the years of punishment, the elbows sharpened through real combat. While across the city Bruce sat alone in his hotel room, not stretching, not shadowboxing, just thinking, replaying movements in his mind, considering distance, timing, angles, not styles, because styles were just names people gave to habits, and habits could be broken. By the time Bruce stepped into the humid night air and made his way toward the stadium, the city felt different, quieter, like it was holding its breath. And although no official crowd had been invited, a handful of trainers, fighters, and promoters lingered in the shadows, drawn by instinct more than curiosity, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Something that wouldn't fit neatly into anyone's narrative. And as Bruce approached the dimly lit ring area behind Lumpini, barefoot on cold concrete, he could already see Somchai standing under the harsh bulbs, shoulders relaxed, expression unreadable, a man who had never been knocked out and didn't believe he ever would be. And in that moment, before a single strike was thrown, before history fractured into rumor and denial, the outcome was already forming, not because one man was stronger or more skilled, but because one of them was fighting to defend an identity, and the other was fighting to reveal a truth that had no country, no flag, and no mercy. The moment Bruce stepped fully into the circle of light behind Lumpinee Stadium, the atmosphere shifted in a way every fighter present could feel, but none could explain. Because this was no longer a meeting of styles or cultures or reputations. It was a collision of assumptions, and Somchai Prasert stood at the center of it with the quiet certainty of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. He didn't bow, didn't posture, didn't waste energy on intimidation, because in his experience, intimidation was unnecessary when reality was on your side, and reality had taught him that bodies broke under elbows, that legs failed under kicks, that smaller men folded when pressure became constant, while Bruce Lee stood opposite him loose and relaxed, arms hanging low, breathing slow, looking less like a fighter preparing for combat and more like a man waiting for a boss. And that contrast alone unsettled a few of the trainers watching from the shadows, though none would admit it aloud. There was no signal to begin, no referee to step between them, because everyone there understood that the fight started the moment both men accepted the space, and Somchai was the first to move, not recklessly but decisively, chopping a low kick into Bruce's lead thigh with the casual violence of someone who had thrown that strike tens of thousands of times. The impact echoing sharply in the enclosed space and drawing a few quiet nods from the Thai fighters who recognized the sound of clean contact, the kind meant to slow an opponent down piece by piece. And Bruce felt it immediately, a deep, dull shock that radiated up the leg. But he didn't retreat or adjust his stance the way most men would. He stepped forward instead, closing distance at an angle that forced Somchai to reset faster than he wanted to. The second kick came heavier, aimed slightly higher, and this time Bruce checked it late, absorbing part of the blow, enough to make clear to anyone watching that Muay Thai power was not theoretical, it was earned. But what happened next broke the rhythm Somchai depended on, because Bruce didn't back away to recover, didn't circle to create space. He stepped inside the pocket where kicks lost meaning and timing ruled everything. And in that half-second of transition, Bruce's lead hand snapped out and struck Somchai's face. Not hard, not dramatic, just fast enough to register. Fast enough to say I can touch you whenever I want. Somchai's eyes narrowed, irritation creeping. And where confidence had been, and he answered the way he always did when pressured, driving forward with a knee meant to crash into Bruce's ribs, followed by an elbow arcing down like a blade, a combination that had ended fights in seconds. But Bruce slipped not away but through, his body rotating just enough that the knee brushed past his hip and the elbow caught air, and suddenly Somchai was off balance. Not much, not visibly, but enough for Bruce to capitalize, firing a side kick into the hinge of Somchai's hip with surgical precision. Not a knockout blow, but a structural one, the kind that disrupted alignment and forced the body to compensate. Somchai felt it, felt his base falter for the first time in years, and anger flared, raw and immediate, because this was not how fights were supposed to go, not against a man with no scars on his shins, no ring record, no proof beyond stories and film. And he surged forward again, abandoning patience, throwing elbows with bad intentions, each one capable of splitting skin and bone, and Bruce moved like water poured just out of reach, never retreating in a straight line, never standing still long enough to be hit cleanly. And for the first time the men watching saw something they struggled to describe later, a kind of control that didn't look aggressive, but left no room for response. Somchai's breathing grew heavier, not from exhaustion, but from confusion, because every strike he threw seemed anticipated, every angle closed before it, fully opened, and when he tried to clinch, to bring the fight back into the grinding reality where Muay Thai reigned supreme, Bruce met him with a short punch to the jaw that snapped his head sideways, followed immediately by a palm strike to the side of the neck that disrupted balance rather than causing visible damage, a sequence so compact and efficient that several witnesses later disagreed on whether it had even happened. Though they all agreed on the result, Somchai staggered. That stagger changed everything, because champions are defined not by how they attack, but by how they respond when control slips, and Somchai responded with fury, charging forward. Feet heavy now. Technique breaking down under the weight of disbelief. And Bruce waited just long enough for momentum to commit before stepping offline and delivering the strike that would end the fight. A short, tight hook that landed flush on the jaw, followed instantly by a second blow. Some said it was another punch. Others swore it was a palm. A few insisted it was an elbow, but all agreed it landed behind the ear, in that small, vulnerable pocket fighters rarely protect, and Somchai Prasert collapsed forward without drama, his body hitting the concrete with a sound that silenced the space completely. For a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because unconsciousness had a finality that stripped away pride and mythology in an instant. And Bruce stood there looking down at the man who had never been knocked out, his chest rising and falling steadily, his expression unchanged, while trainers rushed in to check Somchai's breathing, relieved to find it strong and even. And in that stunned quiet, Bruce did something few expected. He stepped back and bowed, not deeply, not ceremoniously, but sincerely, acknowledging the fighter, the art, the challenge, and then he turned away, already disengaging, already finished, while the men in the shadows exchanged glances they would later deny, knowing they had just witnessed something that didn't fit neatly into their understanding of fighting, something that would be argued about endlessly, dismissed publicly, whispered privately, because what had happened wasn't supposed to be possible. And yet there Somchai lay, breathing but unconscious, while Bruce Lee walked calmly out of the light, leaving behind a silence heavier than any applause. By the time Somchai Prasert opened his eyes, the night had already begun to erase itself. The harsh bulbs behind Lumpinese Stadium dimmed, the small cluster of witnesses thinning out one by one, as men quietly decided it was better not to be remembered as having been there at all, because stories like this were dangerous. They unsettled hierarchies, challenged traditions, and left too many people with questions they didn't want to answer. Somchai sat up slowly, his head pounding, his jaw aching, in a way he had never felt before, and the trainers around him avoided his eyes, not out of shame, but out of uncertainty, because no one knew what to say to a champion who had just been knocked unconscious for the first time in his life by a man who wasn't supposed to belong in that space. And when Somchai finally asked what had happened, the answer came hesitantly, fractured, each version slightly different, but all ending the same way, with him on the ground and Bruce Lee gone. Bruce, for his part, returned to his hotel without ceremony, washed his hands, sat alone for a long time, and said nothing about the fight to anyone outside the small circle of people who already knew better than to ask, because he understood something most men didn't, that the value of a fight wasn't in proving dominance, but in revealing truth, and truth rarely survived exposure to egos, money, and nationalism. By morning, promoters were already smoothing things over, insisting no such fight had taken place, that Bruce Lee had merely visited a gym, that Somchai had suffered nothing more than exhaustion from training, and officially that was the end of it. No reports, no footage, no record. Just a champion who never spoke publicly about that night again, and a foreign visitor who quietly left Thailand days later. But in the underground world of fighters, the story moved fast and changed shape with every retelling. Some said the fight lasted minutes. Others swore it ended in seconds. Some claimed Somchai slipped. Others claimed Bruce used forbidden techniques, and a few insisted it was all a fabrication meant to elevate a movie star. Yet even among the skeptics, there was an unspoken rule that no one laughed too loudly at the idea, because the men who had been there never laughed, never exaggerated, never sought attention. They simply remembered. Somchai returned to the ring months later and continued winning, but those closest to him noticed subtle changes, a hesitation at certain distances, a new respect for speed, a tendency to adjust rather than impose. And when young fighters asked him about Bruce Lee, he dismissed the questions with a shake of his head, not out of bitterness but finality, as if reopening that door served no purpose. Bruce Lee, meanwhile, carried the experience the way he carried everything else, not as a trophy but as confirmation. Another data point in his lifelong pursuit of understanding what actually worked when illusion was stripped away. And, years later, when asked in interviews about style versus style, about kung fu versus boxing or wrestling or Muay Thai, he would smile and say that styles were like boats, useful for crossing rivers, but dangerous if you mistook them for the water itself. a line that sounded philosophical on television but landed differently among fighters who had heard rumors of Bangkok. No footage ever surfaced, no photographs were taken, and everyone with a stake in official narratives had reasons to let the story fade. Yet it never quite did, because somewhere in Thailand there was a champion who knew the feeling of waking up on the ground after believing it could never happen. And somewhere else there were trainers who taught their students to respect speed and close range without ever explaining why. And somewhere in the world Bruce Lee's reputation continued to grow, not because of this fight, but because it fits so cleanly into the pattern of a man who refused to accept limits imposed by tradition or size or expectation. In the end, the fight in Bangkok didn't change Muay Thai, and it didn't need to, just as it didn't change Bruce Lee, because both were already complete in their own way. But it left behind a quiet understanding among those who lived by combat rather than stories, that truth in fighting had no passport, no uniform, and no loyalty beyond effectiveness, and that sometimes the most important battles were the ones that left no evidence at all, only a silence that lingered long after the lights went out and the city moved on, pretending nothing extraordinary had happened. When, for a brief moment in 1972, everything people thought they knew about fighting had been challenged and quietly, irrevocably, changed.